Controlling winter feed costs is among the best ways to ensure profitability in our operations.
Our biggest cost is winter feed, so everything that we can do to minimize the number of days of feeding cows, the cheapest way we can possibly feed those cows is going to make us more profitable. That's the name of the game. We're in business, and that means you got to be profitable.
It also has a great impact on the productivity and health of our soils.
I had a neighbor come and help me one day, and we threw a whole bunch of hoops and cut forage and weighed it, both where it was bale grazed and where it wasn't. And that particular year, we had 800% more production. That particular year was a very good year. But most people will say they get 3, 4, 5 times more production where you fed those bales. So when you think about that, that is awful cheap way of feeding cows when you get that kind of an increase in the yield after the bale grazing.
All that and more on this episode 461 of the Working Cows podcast with my guest, Blain Hjertaas, brought to you by Understanding Ag.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Conry, host of the Working Cows podcast, recorded exclusively in the Understanding Ag studios. Very excited to be joined once again by my guest today, Blain Hjertaas. He is a consultant with Understanding Ag, lives in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Canada, lives in Canada, and so is very familiar with winter and has found some ways within his years of experience of controlling winter feed costs, and we're going to talk to him today about that. Bale grazing, swath grazing, windrow grazing, whatever you call it in your neighborhood. We're going to talk about some of those things and some of the ways that it has impacted the profitability of his operation right after a word from our sponsor today, Understanding Ag. Are rising input costs keeping you up at night? At Understanding Ag, they help producers like you save money and build resilience through regenerative agriculture. Their team of experienced farmers and ranchers will show you how to reduce reliance on costly fertilizers, pesticides, and feed by working with nature, not against it. With proven regenerative practices, you can improve soil health, boost water retention, and increase your land's productivity while cutting expenses. From grazing plans to cover cropping to full system redesigns, they tailor solutions to your land and your goals. Let them help you make the transition from input-intensive, conventional, to profit-enhancing regenerative agriculture. Visit understandingag.com and take the first step toward a more profitable and sustainable future. Blain, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows podcast. Welcome back.
Thank you very much, Clay. It's a privilege to be here.
Yeah, we're coming up on winter grazing season. Some people probably already in kind of that dormant season grazing mode, I suppose. But always a good time, really never a bad time to think about winter grazing because it represents probably one of the biggest cost centers for any agricultural operation is how we handle those dormant season months. And so, yeah, kind of maybe since we're talking Understanding Ag here today, maybe set your context for us a little bit and your experience, and then we'll talk about some of the strategies you guys have used for winter grazing.
Certainly, Clay. So I guess I'm basically retired, but I have been farming now for 51 years. And you're absolutely right. The single biggest cost to running a cow is winter feed. And it's something you need to be thinking about year-round and what you can do to minimize those costs. Because it's, right now we're at record cattle prices, but most of us that have been in the business for a while know that profit isn't always that easy to make in the cow business. So you got to really look at your costs. And if your biggest cost is winter feed, that should be the one you're focusing on. So on our particular operation and many others, what we have done for a long time is in the summer you focus on growing more grass. That's the key. And if you can graze longer earlier in the spring, later in the fall, every single day that you can keep a cow eating grass, whether it's green or brown, doesn't really matter, is money that you're saving. So some of the strategies then to do that are you need to use more cross fencing. You have to tighten up your cow herd, increase your stock density, shorten up your grazing periods, and allow for longer recovery time so that grass has a chance to recover after the grazing event. And so those are the three things that you can do. And as you kind of get better at it and start to get a plan and learn as you go, pretty soon you'll find that you'll have excess grass. If you don't, you probably have too many cows, and probably that would be the first thing, is to maybe you need to reduce a few cows. But once you have grass surplus, that's what we call stockpile grass. And that grass then can be used either late in the season or early the next spring. So you can be out grazing earlier than your neighbors can. Personally, I prefer early spring grazing rather than going late into the winter. Usually when you go late into the winter, it's really easy to melt condition off cows because you're getting colder every day. And as the grass slowly loses its nutrition, if you aren't paying close attention, real quick you can lose a lot of condition. Whereas in the spring, you're in the opposite situation. It's warming up every day, so the cows don't need nearly as much nutrition. Granted, they're later in the gestation period, but you are warming, and also there's new green growth there, which gives you additional nutrition. So that's the simplest way of all of shortening up the winter feeding period, is by just growing.
What are you kind of shooting for? What's your goal when you're grazing? How far into the dormant season are you seeking to graze as things start to wind down for the summer? You're thinking, like we started talking about, this impacts profitability. The sooner I have to start feeding or supplementing impacts profitability. So how far into the dormant season would you typically want to be grazing and feeling good about, okay, we've kind of gotten over that hurdle and we're still going to be able to be profitable, even though we are going to probably have to do something different other than graze 365 days a year?
Well, I personally find that I go mostly by temperature. So when it starts, and I'm going to talk in Celsius here now, you'll have to convert for me, but basically when we start to get a temperature of approximately -20, that's my magic point, that the grass will no longer have enough nutrition to maintain condition on those cows. So then either I have to make the choice of supplement with energy or go to my planned winter stored feed. Either one of those will work. I usually prefer to use the stored feed than either bale grazing or swath grazing or some other method of feeding cows. But so I abandon my grass and I will save it till the following spring.
Yeah, I really think that piece about grazing stockpile forage in the spring is really helpful. And just for those listening, the conversion there, -20 degrees Celsius is -4 degrees Fahrenheit. So, just below zero there. So yeah, that is a good rule of thumb, pretty helpful. So that's the kind of the first of the options, the strategies, right, is that stockpile grazing. And then you mentioned a couple of others, swath grazing and bale grazing. What are the advantages, disadvantages of each of those?
Well, so we'll talk about swath grazing first. So basically you'd plant an annual crop, in spring or June, something like that. One of the better ones are some of the millets. Golden German millet is probably the ultimate. And the reason for that is it has a very waxy cuticle. So the leaves are very waxy. And so once you put it into a windrow, it can be very susceptible to, if you happen to get bad weather, a rainy 2 or 3 weeks, you can have an awful lot of deterioration in quality. whereas the German millet seems to be able to resist that because it has such a waxy cuticle. So the theory then is you plant this crop, say in June when it's basically at the proper stage, you go out with a swather, put it into a windrow, and then once winter comes, you will cross fence that because you need to limit fence it. If you just allow the cows to have access to the entire piece, they will freeze it down as they step on the snow and the swaths and so on. It will freeze down. So you need to do winter fencing, cross fence across so they only have access to a few acres. And even in relatively deep snow clay, these animals, I've actually had to take a shovel or my foot or something and, move the snow away. But as soon as the cows find the swath, they immediately wrap their tongue around the forage and they lift with their heads and they actually pull it up out of the snow. So it's quite amazing to watch. And so once they find the swath, once they find that swath, it's easy. Then they, even through fairly deep snow, they will utilize a good bit of the forage. One of the things that I think is important is a relatively small swather, windrower. If you get, most of the machinery now is getting huge, so you get a 36-foot swath and you have a tremendous concentration of nutrients. Because the cows eat all of those, they're only every 36 feet, so all of the manure and urine is deposited within that very narrow band of 36 feet. So you tend to have very distinct rows in your field the next year. You're concentrating nutrition in those areas. So some of the older swathers, say a 20-foot swather or something like that, in my mind is much more desirable than a very large swather.
Is there... I imagine kind of the key to that is putting that forage in a swath kind of at peak nutrient content. And so you would want, do you look for those plants that are going to come mature in the fall so that you don't have the swath laying out there through the whole growing season? Is that part of the strategy there?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You want to usually they're sowed a little bit later, like maybe early to mid-June, depending on what it is you're using. Yeah. And you want it to be at peak forage, optimum forage condition for cows when you cut it. And ideally that would be, late September, something like that. So it only has to lay for, maybe 6 weeks before utilization or 2 months, something like that. That's the hope anyway.
Sure. And because if you swath it earlier than that, or if you're swathing even maybe like your a forage, even an introduced grass, if you're swathing that when it's at peak optimum quality, then it's going to be laying there for a long time and you can have some issues with kill underneath those windrows. Is that true in your experience?
Yes, it definitely you could have that, and the biggest risk that is certainly is a risk, but the bigger risk yet is if you get inclement weather through say the month of September or October, and you can have that deteriorating quality big time.
Sure.
So that's one of the risks of swath grazing. Also, the other risk with swath grazing is it's not so much a problem here, but I think further south, more where you live, icing is a big issue. If you get that wet, freezing rain earlier in the season and you get a whole layer of ice on top, that can sometimes be a huge negative that you may have to abandon it, go to a different plan. Usually you can utilize it again in the spring, but you need to have some flexibility.
Do you try to avoid swath grazing in the same field multiple years in a row?
You could do it multiple years in a row. Ideally, you'd move your swath over so that, when you're swathing, you wouldn't have the swath in the same spot each year. Go crossways or on the angle or, deliberately go between where the swaths were last year or something, just to avoid the buildup of nutrients in the one spot. But I see no issues really.
Yeah.
You'd want to look at the crop rotation a little bit, and probably you wouldn't want to be growing the same monoculture year after year, but for a year or two, or if you're varying what you're planting, I don't see it would be an issue.
Yeah, I was introduced to swath grazing by Shannon and Melinda Sims in McFadden, Wyoming, and they always say that they live in a cold desert up in the mountains, but their swath grazing, they do a kind of a every other year, basically a checkerboard pattern. So one year they're going north and south, and then the next year they're going east and west. And I think that's, at least that was what they were doing, I think, when I first heard about it. So I think that was one way that they were approaching it. And so I think that's helpful things to think about.
Yeah, excellent strategy. I like that. That makes a lot of sense.
Yep. Okay, so
one of the other strategies that's really cheap is what we call chaff piling.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're now, this, you have to be a crop farmer to make this one work, of course. So you're a mixed farm. But let's say you're growing, small grains, something like oats or barley for cash. You would plant a winter annual in the spring with say your oats. The most common one that would be used would be winter triticale. And so you'd plant half a bushel with the oats in the spring. So that's your only additional cost, is that half bushel of winter trit. Herbicide program stays the same. There's no issues there. You would harvest your oats for cash as if normal. The only difference would be is you'd put a chaff piler on the back axle of your combine, which is sort of like a set of fingers that's counterweighted. So maybe at 500 pounds, this thing drops down the pile of chaff, the stubble pulls it off, and it would spring back up. And so no mechanical parts at all to it. No additional diesel required to run this thing. It's just a mechanical thing that goes up and down. So very, very cheap to do. Most farmers, once they see one, they could build it in their shop on a couple rainy afternoons. So you have these nice green leaves from the winter triticale plus the chaff out there in piles all across your field. And again, once winter comes, you would want to limit fence this, because the cows will freeze it down if they have access to the entire field. So maybe you give them, 15 acres, 10 acres, whatever. The cows then they like the chaff and they love the green leaves. Even under the snow, winter triticale retains its green color very well. So that's sort of like the candy. The cows are busy snuffling through, moving the snow side to side. They find the chaff piles. They eat the chaff piles. Now, they're going to be a little bit low on energy. So most farmers that do this will supplement with some grain, 5 pounds of oats per head per day, or some barley, whatever, their nutritionist or whatever can advise them on what they need. But so you have a very, very cheap feeding system. All you have to do then is supplement your cows on a daily or every second day basis with some form of energy, and the cows are able to utilize the waste of the oat enterprise. And that's when you become profitable, is when you're feeding the waste from one enterprise and making it feed for the next enterprise. One of the cheapest ways that you can winter cows.
Yeah, very good. And also, I think probably I know of people who are using that strategy on rented land. They just ask the farmer to use the buncher for them, and that if they can work that deal out and the farmer's willing, then it's an option there as well, right?
Yeah, and it's good for the grain farmer also, because he's getting that chaff is then being decomposed by the rumen of the cow, so it's totally available for the plants the following spring. Whereas if the chaff is laying on the land, it'll take it at least a year to decompose. So it's a win-win for both.
Let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor today, Understanding Ag. As farmers and ranchers, we've all heard pitches from ag consultants about the next great new product that will increase our yields, pounds, or animal performance. And each of those silver bullets comes with a price tag that you pay year after year, taking more money out of your pockets and putting it into someone else's. Our friends at Understanding Ag aren't out to sell you anything, but the knowledge to grow healthier soils, plants, animals, and profits. Their goal is to help you become your own best manager, a short-term client, but a long-term friend and partner on the road to regeneration. If you're still waiting for that next year that's going to be better, maybe it's time you give Understanding Ag a call. Check them out at understandingag.com. I know you'll be glad you did. Okay, so we've covered dormant season grazing or stockpile grazing. Stated that you prefer that in the spring. Talked about windrow and bunch grazing. You also mentioned earlier, bale grazing. Talk to me about some of the keys to being successful with that.
Well, so bale grazing, then the concept is that, ordinary hay bales, and perfect world, you would leave them right where they fell out of the baler. That would be the cheapest way of doing it. That doesn't always work, but from an ecosystem point of view, that is the ultimate, because then no nutrition is moving off the field. But assuming you have to move them, you move them wherever you need the bales to be. Usually we would recommend that you put them in your better areas and try and make them better yet, to grow the biology out. There's various thinking on how they should be placed, how close they should be, how far apart. Again, I would experiment, practice. Everyone has different ideas on how to do it. There's no right or wrong. Just get the bales out there. Some people like to put them the flat side down. Some people like to put them the round side down. There's advantages and disadvantages of both. If you have inclement weather, the round side down is probably better. But in either way, there's issues. The strings or net wrap are always an issue. How do you deal with that? Some people, remove them all in the fall. Some people, remove them, they'll go out every day and cut 3 or 4 or 10, whatever they need that day, and the cows will eat those bales because they're easier to get. It's easier for them to eat the bales where the net wrap is removed than it is the ones that still have the net wrap on. Some people remove half the net wrap, let them eat it. There's all kinds of different ways of doing it. Again, just go and if you're new to it, go and observe a neighbor or experiment on your own. Just try different ways. There's all kinds of ways. The beauty of it is that all of the nutrition stays out in the field. You don't have to haul any manure. The nitrogen stays right where it is, which is a huge advantage. There was some research done here in Saskatchewan, maybe it's 10 years ago now, where they compared bale grazing to feeding in a corral, and what they were looking at is what happened to the nutrients. And the nitrogen, virtually 100% of it was lost by the time it was loaded up in the corral, hauled out to the field, and spread with a manure spreader. Whereas where the bale grazing was, virtually none of the nitrogen was lost. The phosphorus and the potassium were virtually the same because they're tied up. So they didn't move at all. There was really no difference in phosphorus and potassium, but nitrogen was huge, and nitrogen is key. And it works out quite a bit. When you look at the amount of nitrogen, a 1,400-pound bale has 30 pounds of nitrogen in it. So, that adds up. If you got, 40 bales an acre, that's a lot of nitrogen out there that you're losing if you're feeding in a corral.
Yeah, very good. And I think I actually talked to a guy who was a part of that study, or a very similar one in Alberta, Paul Youngnich, real early on. I think it was probably like episode 4 or 5 of the Working Cows podcast. Yeah. So, going on 8 years ago now.
Yeah, it's a long time ago that study was done. Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so bale grazing, some things to consider, some things to think about. What are kind of bale spacings that you have seen work well, and some of those things?
Well, I don't know if I have a definitive answer. I used to like mine relatively close, like say 10, 14, 15 feet apart kind of a deal, because I wanted to kind of plaster it fairly good. When I did an area, I wanted it, the whole area to be covered in residue. The first time I ever bale grazed, and I think everyone the first time you bale graze, when spring comes, you go, Oh, no, it killed my grass, because you got this horrendous mess out there of litter and cow manure, and, it looks awful. It's terrible, and, your first instinct is to go find a harrow or something and try and get this huge mass of residue leveled out a little bit so something can grow. But I would encourage you just to have a little bit of patience, let Mother Nature work, and you will be absolutely amazed what will happen in 2 or 3 months. Most of that residue disappears. It just rots away because it's packed down. There's a lot of nutrition in there. And the bacteria, the various critters in the soil, they get busy and they go to work. They're happier than, very, very happy. And, they decompose that, and then you will be absolutely amazed at what happens in future years. I did, when I first started, I did some measurements. I had a neighbor come and help me one day, and we threw a whole bunch of hoops and cut forage and weighed it, both where it was bale grazed and where it wasn't. And that particular year, we had 800% more production. Now, you won't get that every year, but that particular year was a very good year. But most people will say they get 3, 4, 5 times more production where you fed those bales. So when you think about that, that is awful cheap way of feeding cows when you get that kind of an increase in the yield after the bale grazing.
I say this about bale grazing kind of to make people think, but I always say it's the fastest way to improve ground slowly. Because it improves a really small area incredibly, but it takes a long time to cover a large area doing it. And we've done most of our winter feeding has been bale grazing here. We've done swath grazing as well, but the bale grazing is incredible. In our experience, we're on very degraded hay fields that we're trying to regenerate. And in our experience, year 1, you will have forbs. Some people might call them weeds, but we'll call them forbs and more grass. And then year 2, you'll have more grass, and many of those, much of that new growth, more grass will be natives. And then it just keeps getting better from there. And I think we're 6 years out from where we did it the first time. And it's still better. We haven't done it there again, and it's still better. You can see those spots, those round spots out there, where the natives are growing, and then right next, as soon as you get outside of that ring, you're back to the bare ground, and the crested wheat is what we have here, the introduced grass. And so, it's been we do some every winter now because of that, and just kind of slowly creep across the place. So,
very similar experience here, Clay. It's incredible. I'm almost 30 years, I think, since my first go. And I don't see the bump in yield anymore in that old stuff, but my feet know it when I walk.
Yeah.
I can feel the difference in the land. So I still think I'm just not measuring it good enough. My hunch is there will be differences, but just walking across at a quick look, I don't really see a huge difference in the grass, but my feet know instantly where the bale was, so it's a long-term fix for a lot of problems that we've created ourselves.
Yeah. My wife always tells people, if you led me blindfolded across our place, I could tell you where we bale grazed.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And it is.
You're right. In year 1, you're going to have more forbs, especially Canada thistle is the dominant one here. A lot of it depends on the quality of the forage you're feeding. In a couple of very bad years, I used straw as my bale grazing source, and then used grain as a supplement. And so you had a lot of material left behind because, of course, cows don't eat the straw very well. So there was a pile of residue when spring came. But, and the Canada thistles came very, very well. But as you say, within a year or 2, that disappears again, and the grass just gets better and better and better. In some ways, straw is even better because you got more residue there, but it's not really the greatest feed for cows, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yep. No, that is Good thing to think about there. I appreciate that. Okay, so anything? Oh, one other thing on bale grazing. You mentioned your bale spacing, and so essentially you're trying to get the two bales to touch. Right, when they get spread out, you want those two bales to touch, right? Or
Almost, yeah.
all that, the whole
Now,
grid to basically be covered with the spread out hay.
Yeah. Now, some people do it different. They'll put them further apart, and then maybe in a year or two, they'll go back in and put the bales in the alternate spots.
Yep.
And whether that's better or worse, I would experiment on your own farm and, determine, I really believe that we need to experiment on our own, and try different things and see, learn what's best for us. Just because Blain did it, it's in Saskatchewan doesn't mean it's right for you in South Dakota.
Yep.
We got to learn on our own and figure it out.
Yep. No, I appreciate it. Okay. So we've got stockpile grazing, windrow and swath grazing and bunch grazing, bale grazing. What else? What other strategies are you looking at?
Well, the other one that is becoming very popular here in Western Canada is grazing corn. So corn produces the most biomass per acre of any of the crops that we can grow. And so they're using grazing corn, which is a little bit different. It has a lower lignin content, so the cows tend to eat the stalks. Now, it doesn't grow corn like dent corn, like grain corn does. And so that, again, works really well. You have to, again, limit feed it. You got to mow strips in it, this time of year. So you can run electric fences across because you don't want the cows running through the whole thing. You want to let them eat 2 acres or 3 acres and then move them ahead. The downside to corn is that it's a very high energy crop, but very low protein. So you need to be thinking about that. So one of the strategies a lot of people are using is they're planting either hairy vetch with the corn. Hairy vetch is a very, very aggressive plant, and most people will know that corn doesn't like any kind of competition early. So the strategy is to use Roundup Ready grazing corn. So you plant the hairy vetch with the corn. Glyphosate or Roundup is used, to control the weeds, and that makes the hairy vetch extremely sick. Doesn't kill most of, there might be the odd plant dies, but generally it just kind of feels sorry for itself. It kind of lays prostrate on the ground for 3 weeks or so. By that time, the corn is growing up quite a bit, so it's not nearly as worried about competition, and then the hairy vetch starts to feel better again and gets growing, and that gives you your protein for cow feed. So that works really well. The other one that is working well here is what we call forage soybeans, which are regular soybeans that are designed for someplace like Alabama or Mississippi. So in our colder conditions here in the northern plains, they will never come to seed, like never flower. So they just grow forage. They just keep climbing up the corn. And they can also be Roundup Ready. So again, that gives you your protein to kind of help balance that corn. And so guys are doing very, very well by using corn. Again, it's a very, very cheap way of grazing. If you grow a decent crop of corn, guys are getting 200 animal days an acre, 250 animal days an acre on corn, which becomes very, very cheap. Again, no yardage, no manure to haul away. Everything is returning to the land. So it's a system that works well.
And also limiting access, right? I mean, giving them a week or so at a time or something like that.
Yeah, that's key. You have to be good with electric fence in the winter, and that is a challenge.
What are some of the challenges there as far as being good with electric fence in the winter?
Well, you have to know how to build a fence. That's part of it is how good are your cows well trained to electric fence. Mm-hmm. If you use electric fence all summer, you do it well, so the cows respect the fence, likely it'll work well for you in the winter. But a lot of people will decide, well, the cows are used to barbed wire, so they put up this one wire fence out there, and the cows look at that and they just jump over it and they have a mess right away. So you have to have in those situations, you just about have to have two wires, one as a ground and one is hot. So because in deep snow and cold conditions, the snow is basically an insulator. The cow will not the cow has to touch the earth to get grounded, so she gets a shock. So you have to do it a different way by having two wires, so she touches them both, and that gives her the shock.
Sure. And when grazing standing corn, is there, you're talking about the grazing corn, that the species of corn that you use for grazing. So does it produce less of a head of corn then, or?
Yeah, the cobs aren't, it has cobs, but
Right.
but it isn't like grain corn.
Right.
It's not bred for grain. It's bred for producing forage. So it's a totally different breeding program. I don't know a whole lot about corn breeding, so I'm certainly not the expert there, but I know that it's different, and I believe it also has lower lignin levels than grain corn does. So the cows will eat the stalks to some extent.
Sure. And when you're talking about using two wires, one as a ground, are those two really close together on the post then?
Yeah, relatively close, yes, because they have to, touch it with their nose or something, so that both, or if cows usually have a lot of winter hair, so it's hard for, if they just touch their sides, they won't always get a good shock.
So
yeah, it can be a challenge.
Yeah. What kind of post do you prefer in that scenario? Do you have one that stands out?
Most guys are using wooden. They'll pound a few wooden posts in just to give it some stability. Because the other issue you run into with grazing corn is you will have wildlife are also attracted into the system. So you're going to be dealing with a few moose, maybe an elk or two, and probably some deer. And so they tend to run into a fence. So if you just have temporary posts in there, you quite often will have the whole fence pulled out or tipped over or something. And so you have cows everywhere, which you got to get chased back and get the fence back up. And so that becomes not that much fun in the winter, especially if you're dealing with deep snow. So most guys that are good at this will put, not a lot, but they will put some wooden posts in just to give it some stability.
Sure.
And then they pull them out again in the spring, and it's not a big deal. But if you do it and plan for it in the fall when you're cutting your lines for the fence, it's not a big deal.
Yep. And so like every third or fourth step in post, you'd have a wood post. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, every 100 feet or whatever. Yeah, depending on your terrain a bit. But
right.
Yes, sure. Absolutely.
Yep. And it sounds like an O'Brien post or something similar would be kind of what you're thinking of, though.
Yeah.
For your step-ins. Yeah.
Yeah, some guys use an electric drill and, will just make a little hole and push the post in, or depending on what your ground is like, some people can step them in, but yeah.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Very good. So have we covered the strategies that you had in mind? Or are there more?
That's the ones that I know about that seem to work well up here, Clay. It's, those are the four basic ones. Just the main one is grow more grass in the summer, and then your stockpile. And then, if you are a cropper, using the waste of one crop to feed another, using those chaff piles, and then cutting swaths, corn grazing, and then bale grazing.
Sure.
Each one of them has a cost, but it's considerably less than feeding in a corral.
Yep. Yeah. And, one of my favorite quotes about winter feeding is that really it's not the cost of the inputs always, it's the cost of the inputting. And so when you can do something like bale grazing, you're saving that cost in a big way, right?
Yeah, huge. Yeah.
One of my favorite.
It's all about cost.
Yeah. One of my favorite examples for bale grazing is a friend of mine who, when he bale grazes, he just puts half of the sisal twine in his baler that it calls for, and so those bales are kind of wrapped just enough to keep them together while they come out of the baler, and then that sisal twine rots off, and he doesn't have to go out and take anything off. They just eat it with the twine on it, and it works for him.
That is the ultimate system in my mind, if you can use sisal twine and do exactly like that. The first year I ever did it, was smart enough to use sisal twine, but I was still a grain farmer in my head, and I didn't like all that residue, so I went out and harrowed it. All I succeeded in doing is I rolled up all the sisal twine in great big balls, and that took about 4 years to rot, whereas the stuff I didn't harrow it was all gone within a couple of months. So
Right.
Don't harrow it would be my advice.
One thing that we should talk about on this topic of winter feeding is winter water. And one of the strategies you mentioned stands out to me as far as kind of killing two birds with one stone, that these cows are going to be watered in the process of eating, and that was the swath grazing that you talked about. They're wrapping their tongue around that forage and pulling it up. Well, they're inevitably going to get some snow and ice and other things with that, and satisfy some of their water requirement. Is that true in your experience?
Absolutely. I believe fully in using snow as a water source. Whether you're bale grazing, swath grazing, chaff pile grazing, doesn't matter. Snow is your absolute cheapest source of water. Not everyone thinks that's feasible, and if you don't think it's feasible, don't do it. Spend money and get some kind of a winter water system in. But I would encourage everyone to try it. You think about the bison that roamed across the prairies for the last 10,000 years. Nobody cut ice for them in the winter or anything. They did just fine on snow. My cows haven't had water in 20, 30, almost 30 years now, and they're doing just fine. Works very well, but again, if you're going to use snow as your water source, you need to be very aware of what you're doing, and you have to have movement across the landscape. You can't leave them sitting on the same spot for 2 months because it freezes down. So as long as you're moving a fence to let them have new forage, they're also going to be accessing new snow. And so then you're perfectly fine. As long as they have clean snow to work in, they will more than adequately satisfy their water requirements. Works very, very well, and it gives you ultimate flexibility. You don't need to worry, well, I can't go over there because I don't have any water. Well, the only issue you run into is sometimes on your shoulder season, maybe late in November, early December, depending on where you are in latitude, or again, early in the spring, you can run into situations where either the snow all melts quickly on you, or, it ices up on you, and you may have to then, have a tank and haul water for a few days to satisfy the requirements.
So would you say that it really doesn't have to be snow that has fallen in the last week? It just has to be snow that they haven't had access to yet. So if you've got snow that's been laying out there for months, but they've never trampled it, and you're giving it to them fresh for that week or whatever, they're going to be able to get by on it.
They will get by on it. If it's super, super crusted, like if there's been warm days, where it's crusty, sometimes that can be an issue, but usually they will tromp around in it and break the crust with their feet. And usually underneath that crust, the snow will be perfectly fine. But you need to monitor, if you see all their noses are bloody, because they've been poking hard trying to get moisture, maybe you need to rethink. Maybe you need to bring the water tank out in the water trough and water them, monitor carefully what you're doing. But I find that it doesn't matter whether it's old or new snow. It's basically frozen water, all of it. So,
yep. And are there anything that you feel like you need to have out for them? Salt, mineral, anything like that helps with the winter watering on snow, or is it? I mean, they get by.
They get by. I don't think salt or mineral will help or hinder that process. That's
yeah. It is a paradigm challenge for sure. For me, just always that is a good thing to have my own paradigms challenged, because that's a big cost savings. If you don't have to bury a water line 6 or however deep you have to bury a water line in Saskatchewan so it doesn't freeze, and so.
No, that's right. Winter water is very, very expensive, and also it limits you to certain pieces of land. Whereas if you just get your brain around snow works, that gives you ultimate flexibility.
Very good. I really appreciate it. Anything else on this subject that comes to mind that we should include here?
No, I think we've covered the basics of it. I guess to me the key is that we're not moving. We're keeping that nutrition on the land where we want it, so we aren't losing anything. Whereas when you start to feed in the corral, you're basically losing all your nitrogen. Plus, we know that our biggest cost is winter feed. So everything that we can do to minimize the number of days of feeding cows, longer we can grow grass, and then the cheapest way we can possibly feed those cows is going to make us more profitable. And that's the name of the game. We're in business. We're in business, and that means you got to be profitable.
Yep. And it's always going to be cheaper to move cows to feed than it is feed to cows. And they have legs, so they can move themselves to feed.
Yes, absolutely. And to new snow too, yeah.
Right. Very good. Blain, well, I appreciate your time today. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Clay. Have a great week.
Very good stuff there with Blain. Really appreciate his heart, his understanding, his experience, and his willingness to share that regarding winter feed costs, winter feeding strategies, and winter watering strategies, which I think is honestly the most paradigm challenging part of this conversation for me personally. Very much looking forward to welcoming back to the Working Cows podcast, Dallas Mount. Once again, talk to him. And we're going to talk to him this time about how do we add diversity to our operations well? How do we do it in a way that's not just adding diversity for diversity's sake? So really appreciate his perspective and look forward to sharing that with you coming your way real soon on another episode of the Working Cows podcast. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.